And joining us now is Matthew Light. He is a professor at the University of Toronto's Centre for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies, and he's here to tell us all about Sochi, which I suspect many people never heard of before the Vancouver Games, but you're going to tell us all about it. Matthew, welcome to TVO.
Thank you. I'm glad to be with you.
Let's put a map up first of all so we can tell everybody where this is. Sochi is on the Black Sea. It is in Russia, on the northeast corner. Population 400,000, so it's not a tiny place. In Krasnodar, which is the third largest Russian region. But here is something interesting. Subtropical climate. The average January temperature is only 6 degrees Celsius. If you thought the Vancouver Games were hot, many people are saying you ain't seen nothing yet. You've spent time there and in the surrounding region, so just tell us a little bit about this place. What's it like?
Well, it's a lovely region with a unique natural environment, which I think, as you say, many people would not associate with Russia. The coastline is subtropical. There are also the end of the Caucasus Mountains, which is where the ski events will be held. The region has an interesting history. It was incorporated into the Russian Empire in a series of wars in the 19th century with the native Circassian peoples who formerly inhabited the coastal area and much of the North Caucasus. And the word Sochi is actually from their language.
So it's not Russian?
Not originally, yeah.
Huh, okay.
The population now is primarily Russian, although with minorities from a variety of different backgrounds, including the indigenous people I mentioned. There's a substantial Armenian community in Sochi itself, which has been heavily involved in the city's main business, which has been the hospitality industry. Sochi was the leading resort of the Soviet Black Sea coast, along with the Crimea, which is now in the Ukraine, meaning that in the post-Soviet period, it's become Russia's leading destination for a warm vacation. And as you mentioned, it's actually the warmest part of a very cold country.
What's the state of the Olympic-style infrastructure that they've got there?
Well, this has been an issue all along since then President Putin persuaded the IOC to select Sochi. There are a number of issues that were raised and are actually still being raised. One is the lack of sports facilities, and President Putin, now Prime Minister Putin, promised to construct them very quickly. Another issue is the physical infrastructure of the city itself, the sewerage, roads, other transportation facilities. And then finally, there's a question of the quality of the tourist accommodations and the general ability to receive a large number of guests.
Sounds like what you're saying is they haven't got anything there. I know they don't have a hockey arena. They got the Winter Games somehow, and they don't even have a hockey arena there.
Well, Sochi was a resort for Soviet citizens, and it's a lovely area, but it has to be said that the infrastructure is not up to the standards of Western countries.
What are the principal challenges involved in getting it up?
I think a number. The extremely short time frame. Also, the question of how the process is being handled, which has a number of dimensions. One is that there's a certain element of cronyism that seems to be emerging in the construction process. And there's concerns about the quality of the sites that are being built. Another one has to do with the very sensitive environment of the region. There's actually a large, what we would call a national forest, or a very important nature preserve there, which is being heavily impacted by the construction of the sports facilities that will be needed for the winter events. A third is how this whole process is involving or benefiting or not benefiting the residents of the region. So there have been a number of very disturbing reports about, for example, buildings being condemned on rather suspicious grounds and then being acquired by Moscow businesses at less than their true value, or people being forced out of their businesses, possibly with threats.
So the rumors that we hear about corruption are not just rumors; they're true.
I think not. I mean, I think this has been a concern all along, and it would be hard to dismiss it given the amount of evidence that has been emerging.
This was reported in the Moscow Times a couple of weeks ago. The Sochi Olympic Games are so important for Russians, they will not be allowed to fail. Senior Canadian IOC member Dick Pound said, "Whatever has to be done will be done." What do you think that means, Matt?
Well, I think it goes back to President Putin's very personal commitment to the IOC to make the Games a success. And at the time, he lobbied very strongly for them, and Sochi was something of an underdog, if you recall. It faced very strong competition from Austria and South Korea, both of which had more developed facilities at the sites that they were offering for the Olympics. And President Putin made a number of arguments, presumably also other ones in private, but some of the points that he raised were that Russia is a major Olympic country. It hasn't had an Olympiad since 1980, and it's sort of its turn. And the concerns about construction and security were raised at the time, and he made it clear that Sochi is very much his project, and that he would do whatever it would take to ensure that the Games would be a success.
What does that mean, though? It sounds like a totalitarian threat in some respects, doesn't it?
Well, I think that would be putting it too strongly. I think it means that he would not allow the process to be hijacked by, that he would give it his full attention and make sure that the construction is done adequately and that the other concerns of the IOC were addressed and that this would not be delegated or to people who would not be reporting to him directly. So apparently the IOC was convinced.
Well, we knew what it meant in China. It
Right.
meant that if they wanted to shut the whole city down, all the businesses, all the factories, to get the air pollution down, they could do that. If it meant, people not being allowed to strike or, working around the clock, they could do that. Is that the plan in Russia too, do you think?
I think that Russia is a somewhat different country from China, although their systems of government could both be described as authoritarian. I think that the capacity of the Chinese state to marshal that kind of repression for a political goal is actually somewhat greater than that of Russia, although some reports I've been reading about, for example, the intimidation of Russian media who've been trying to cover some of the problems with Sochi are similar to what we might have expected from China. But I am a bit concerned that the Russian government may not be able to live up to its promises, no matter how many phone calls President Putin makes to local bigwigs.
I would like to put another map up right now, not so much to show where Sochi is on the map, but rather to show the neighborhood it is in.
Yes.
Because it is a fairly dangerous neighborhood. Let's put this up if we can. Regional security is a big issue. Here are the North Caucasus. And besides Sochi, you have very close by Georgia, which fought a war with Russia just a couple of years ago, Abkhazia, North and South Ossetia, the South Ossetian part being a potential, separatist state. It's a dangerous neighborhood. Two angles I want to go here. Hold off on the security angle for a second. Let's talk first about multiculturalism. We're into multiculturalism in this country. How about in Russia?
Well, Russia and the Soviet Union before then have a long history of being a multi-ethnic state. And just as in Canada, exactly what that means is open to question. As the map shows, the shaded regions are autonomous republics that were created specifically and given a slightly different legal status within the Russian Federation to accommodate indigenous non-Russian populations. Of course, with the breakup of the Soviet Union, Russia has become a less multi-ethnic state than the Soviet Union was, but it still has significant non-Russian minorities, and the North Caucasus region is an area where they're concentrated. Are
minorities embraced in Russia?
Well, this is a very politically fraught question, and on the one hand, the reality is very complex, and a lot of people live together in peace. There are many intermarriages. Many people enjoy the cultural variety, just as we do in Canada. On the other hand, particularly with respect to the Caucasus, there is the underlying issue, which is that this is an area of insurrection or of low-level civil war and has been for some time. And unfortunately, that has sort of poisoned or at least seriously affected how a lot of people in Russia feel about ethnic groups indigenous to the Caucasus. And the most difficult relationship is probably with the Chechen community of Russia. But to a lesser extent, a very significant extent though, other ethnic groups in the Caucasus have also sort of become the brunt or the object of suspicion and concern by the Russian population.
Well, let me pick up on the Georgian angle, because Sochi is just a stone's throw from Georgia. And they had a war 2 years ago. Are there concerns that something could flare up on that border and ruin these games?
I think there are concerns that there could be another war. It would be foolish to dismiss that possibility. Neither side really achieved its war objectives, depending on what you think those objectives are. Many people think that Russia would like to bring about the removal of the government of Georgia and replace it with a more pro-Russian administration, and that hasn't happened. And at the same time, the underlying issues regarding the status of the two separatist regions of Georgia, South Ossetia and Abkhazia, have not been resolved. So
maybe we could bring that map up again so we can just look at these, because it is true. Georgia is, I mean, Georgia has problems of its own in terms of separatist movements. Abkhazia on the western part, and then South Ossetia, which neither of which they recognize as independent places, obviously. They think that's all part of their territorial integrity. So what's the potential for some kind of flare-up in those two spots?
Well, following the 2008 war between Georgia and Russia, Russia recognized both of those regions as independent states, an act that has not been very widely imitated by other countries.
Or endeared them to the West, quite
Certainly
frankly.
not, that's right. They, of course, cite the example of Kosovo. This is a matter of international law that I don't feel competent to judge, but in any case, it's certainly raising the ante, and it's has obviously angered the Georgian government. So there are certainly scholars who argued that, and journalists as well, that it's entirely likely that the disputed status of these two regions, plus the Kremlin's animosity against the government of Georgia, could lead to another war within the next few years.
I'm not asking you to predict the future, because obviously no one can do that, but you know, you go a little further east and you've got Chechnya there as well. And it was only a few years ago that there was just absolutely brutal fighting between Russians and Chechens. This is, I mean, does it make you wonder why the IOC would agree to go to a place that is in such a dangerous neighborhood?
Yes, I have thought about that. A lot of people thought about it. I think there are a couple of points to bring up. One is that the situation in Chechnya has changed over the last several years. And I think it's begun receiving more international attention than it was a few years ago. If you recall, there were two sort of flare-ups of outright war. One was in the mid-90s, 94, 95, early 96. And then the last one was at the beginning of President Putin's, well, he was then initially the prime minister, but became president, in 1999 to 2000, in which the then separatist government of Chechnya was overthrown. And following that, the government of Russia installed a local figure to be, in effect, its representative in Chechnya, a man named Kadyrov. And for a while, it seemed as though the strategy of sort of Chechenization, if you will, plus large infusions of cash, had succeeded in at least reducing the level of violence. And it's certainly true that Russia crushed the outright insurrection and destroyed the separatist government. Now, that takes us up to the mid-2000s, which was when Russia was preparing its bid for the IOC. And of course, Putin emphasized that the situation was under control and that there was nothing to fear on the score of the North Caucasus political turmoil. Since then, since about 2007, in fact, there's been a noticeable trend toward an increase in violence in the region, which has taken the form of a number of terrorist attacks, the assassination of political figures. The luxury train from Moscow to St. Petersburg was bombed quite recently. It was a very spectacular incident. And the trend appears to be that the conflict in the North Caucasus has changed its character. So whereas initially it was a Chechen separatist government opposing Moscow, it's now become something much more diffuse, and it's no longer localized only in Chechnya. So there is a kind of loose structure of guerrilla or terrorist, depending on your political views, fighters, some of them with a strong Islamist orientation, who are active throughout the North Caucasus. And in a way, this sort of trend, or the transformation of the insurrection, or the low-level insurgency, is in some ways more disturbing than the previous war, because it suggests the possibility that this violence could spread into or close to Sochi.
So based on what you know, the possibility of terrorism disrupting these games is what?
I think it's realistic. I mean, I'm sure that the Russian government is taking every step it possibly can to prevent that, and obviously they have many sources of information that I don't have. It's been reported in the media that they have been conducting various kinds of exercises in the region to sort of train for this eventuality, and also installing other kinds of military equipment that would help them prevent a terrorist attack. Of course, the problem of fighting terrorism is that it's unpredictable what form it will take or where it will strike. And as older viewers will remember, the Olympic Games of 1972 in Munich were disrupted by a terrorist incident, and that was in a city that was not in a zone of conflict. So it's also possible that there might not be attacks on Sochi, but there might be some kind of serious incident in the North Caucasus region that would, even if it didn't actually injure people at Sochi's Olympics, might frighten them or would certainly ruin the mood of festivity and celebration that one associates with the Olympics.
Is there a part of you that kind of wishes the Games were not going to Sochi, given all of this?
Well, as a scholar, I don't really consider it my role to take sides in a matter like that. I think,
but as someone who's interested in world peace, what's your view on it in that case?
I think it's a complicated issue, and I'm happy to sort of summarize my views on the different parameters of it. On the one hand, Russia is a major Olympic country, and it has been a long time since they hosted an Olympics, and I believe they've never hosted a Winter Olympics. So one can understand why the Russians would think that their time has come, especially with the sort of recovery from the 1990s economic crisis, and they certainly have the money to host an Olympics now. That's not an issue, right? So if they offered to do it, one can see why the IOC would have to take that request very seriously. And given that the Olympics were held in Beijing, which also caused some people to raise their eyebrows, it would be hard to argue that the Olympics can never be hosted by any country that's not a pristine or unblemished democracy. I guess my concerns about the Olympics in Sochi are more focused on the impact it's going to have on the local population, some of the issues of corruption and abuse that I described, security threat, although I still think it's a question of a possibility rather than a certainty or even a likelihood. And then there's another issue which I think has some resonance for us as Canadians, which is the way the games are being presented and the way they impact the indigenous people of the region, the Circassians. As I mentioned, Sochi itself is a Circassian word. There was a very violent struggle in the 19th century between the imperial government of Russia and the indigenous people, which resulted in the expulsion and death of many of them. Many of those people's descendants now live in the Middle East, Turkey, and places like Jordan and Syria. And the remaining community in Russia itself, I have visited there and talked to some representatives of that community, and they have expressed some grievances about the way the Olympics are being handled. For one thing, the lack of recognition of the mixed Russian-Circassian character of this site. So one of the things I thought was very striking about the recent Vancouver Olympics was the very clear attempt to involve representatives of First Nations in the celebration, which was very striking at the opening ceremonies when representatives of First Nations actually welcomed visitors to Vancouver. And certainly as North Americans, we have to be mindful of our own history of our difficult and at times very ugly history with the native peoples of this continent. So it's not a question of condemning Russia for something that is not unique to Russia. It's a question of whether Russia is really willing to recognize sort of the claims, the symbolic and historical claims of its indigenous peoples, including in this respect. There are further aspects of this problem. One is that a number of the winter sports sites are being constructed in areas that hold historic significance for the Circassian people. So, for example, the site of Krasnaya Polyana, which actually means red meadow, that term, the red, refers to the blood of people who were killed in a major battle there between the Russians and Circassians. And so many Circassians would say that this is not an appropriate or respectful use of an historic site. So the analogy that comes to mind would be, holding an Olympic event in Canada on the Plains of Abraham. Right? It's just there's something disturbing.
Bad taste at the very least.
Yes, at the very least. Right.
Matt, it's good of you to come in tonight and give us our really first in-depth look at where the Olympics will be held in 2014. Sochi, Russia. Matthew Light, professor from the University of Toronto Centre for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies. Thanks so much.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.